It really is a very tough ask, actually, to get a couple of politicians to talk to a conference just 10 days out from a very hard-fought federal election. But ACSI has indeed achieved that. And this next session will give you a better understanding of where the two major parties sit in terms of their response to the Royal Commission and the governance issues that are facing Australian companies at the moment. You'll hear first from Andrew Leigh, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, who has another commitment and must leave us shortly after 3, and then from Jane Hume, the Senator for Victoria and Chair of the Economics Legislation Committee. We're essentially going to run this session in 2 parts, with each of our speakers speaking for about 15 minutes, followed immediately by questions, then the next speaker, and then questions. Andrew is the Shadow Assistant Treasurer and Federal Member for Fenner in the ACT. He's been a member of the Australian Labor Party since 1991, and prior to being elected, he was a Professor of Economics at ANU. He holds a PhD in Public Policy from Harvard, and he graduated from the University of Sydney with a first-class degree in Arts and Law. So I imagine you've got a few answers to some of the dilemmas that we have looked at today. Please welcome Andrew Leigh.
Thanks very much for a most generous introduction. Can I, of course, acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose lands we meet today and pay my respect to their elders. I also acknowledge my colleague, Jane Hume. Thanks to the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors for the chance to speak with you today about Labor's positive plans for the economy. In an era of shrill soundbites, your organisation has a track record of producing careful research that shapes policy debates. Your research reports have dovetailed closely with Labor's priorities, covering topics such as modern slavery, fossil fuel investments and whistleblowing. I know ACSI research is closely read by my colleagues Chris Bowen, Jim Chalmers, Claire O'Neill, Madeline King and Matt Thistlethwaite. Fresh ideas can help shape the policy debate for the better. To take just one example, you publish an annual report on CEO pay in ASX 200 firms. Last July, the ACSI report found that the best paid CEO in Australia, Don Mage, received $37 million. Commentators were quick to note the contrast between this pay packet and the reported underpayment of Domino's pizza workers. 4 months later, in November, I announced that a Labor government would require large listed firms to publish the ratio of CEO pay to the pay of the median worker in that firm, as is done in Britain and the United States. With real wage growth for most workers flatlining, we believe such reporting will encourage companies to ensure that pay rises happen across the firm and not just in the corner office. Our package is backed by investors, unions, and by Don Mage himself, who said that Labor's plan would promote transparency and help lift the pay of workers, and that it would not be onerous for firms who already keep significant data on employee pay. Labor believes that markets, like gardens, grow best in sunlight. That's why we're committed to a register of beneficial ownership and country-by-country reporting of tax payments for the largest multinationals, to disclosure of tax haven dealings, and the reporting of the gender pay gap for big employers. If you're tendering for a large government contract while headquartered in the Cayman Islands, you'll have to fess up about it. And a Labor government would work with superannuation funds to develop appropriate guidelines for investment in tax havens. Now, I imagine I might have just mentioned a few policies you haven't heard about before, and that illustrates the broad point that I wanted to make to you today. Over the past 6 years, Labor has spent our time engaging with community groups and corporate leaders, union members and think tanks. We've had one leader, one deputy leader, one shadow treasurer, one shadow health minister, one shadow attorney general. And for that matter, I've been the shadow assistant treasurer during our time in office, during our time in opposition, helping to craft our policies on tax, competition, charities and productivity. Stability of personnel has meant that our energies have been channelled into policy development. Now, lacking fresh ideas of their own, our opponents have resorted to prefabricated fear campaigns. Too many Morrison ministers are ducking policy debates. Their energy policy is not to have a policy. There's no long-term vision about competition reform, tax reform, education or foreign policy. The Germans have a word that sums up the coalition's predicament: Zugzwang, the situation in which a player would prefer to pass and only makes a move because the rules of the game compel them to do so. Now that's a particular problem because Australia faces some serious economic challenges. Living standards have stagnated. Wage growth has hit record lows. Business investment has fallen. Energy costs have risen. Household debt is at record highs. Government debt has doubled and in net terms is now almost $15,000 per person. Over the past generation, inequality has risen. Home ownership is at its lowest level since the 1950s. From a productivity standpoint, there's signs the economy has become less dynamic. A recent study by Sasan Bakhtari found that the business startup rate had fallen from 15% to 9% over the previous decade. As the author noted, the Australian entrepreneurial landscape has become less dynamic and more hazardous. Relatively fewer entrepreneurs are entering the market, and those that enter are more likely to exit. Many sectors of the economy are dominated by a few big firms. The Harvard-MIT Atlas of Economic Complexity ranks Australia lamentably low for our degree of economic diversification. When it comes to economic policy making, politicians have a responsibility not only to incumbent businesses, but also to creating the right ecosystem for new challenges to emerge and for entrepreneurship to thrive. That means that the relationship needs to be akin to the position of planets in the solar system orbiting the sun. Too far away and you're out of touch. Too close and the risk of crony capitalism becomes excessive. So while the anti-growth Greens are on Neptune, the Liberals are on Mercury, where the heat tends to burn up any intelligent life, Labor comfortably occupies the third rock from the sun. We're a pro-market party that wants the best for the economy, not just today's business, but tomorrow's startups. Our plan for productivity relies around investing. We'll invest in individuals by boosting early childhood, funding to public schools, raising apprenticeship rates, and uncapping university places. We'll invest in infrastructure with an NBN service guarantee, an ambitious plan for more rail, better roads and expanded bike paths. We'll invest in institutions with an Australian investment guarantee, a Future Asia strategy and a focus on science, research and collaboration between universities and business. And the investment approach to productivity seeks to raise living standards without leaving people behind. It stands in contrast with our conservative opponents who typically see productivity as being about cutting protection for workers, cutting environmental regulation, cutting the social safety net. Theirs is a race to the bottom. Ours, a race to the top. When it comes to getting market institutions right, no sector is more important than finance. Simply put, the role of finance is to match the supply of short-term savings with the demand for long-term loans. The sector often gets a bad rap. As Nobel laureate Bob Shiller has noted, finance is widely viewed as an activity that promotes inequality. But he argues that in fact the industry serves a vital social purpose. As he says, done well, financial institutions can be democratising and can reduce inequality if they're set up right. Finance is not merely about making money. It's about achieving our deep goals and protecting the fruits of our labours. It's about stewardship and therefore about achieving the good society. 3 years ago, Labor made the decision to call for a Banking Royal Commission. I don't think there's many now who'd argue that that was a mistake. But at the time, plenty argued we were merely playing politics. Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg variously said it was regrettable, a populist whinge, a reckless distraction and a QC's complaints desk. Unlike them, Malcolm Turnbull since had the honesty to apologise to the Australian people for delaying a Royal Commission. The Hayne Royal Commission concluded that institutions had pursued short-term profit at the expense of basic standards of honesty. Misconduct either went unpunished or was met with an inadequate response. Customers paid for products that were inadequate or non-existent. Large banks took advantage of their market power imbalance with their customers to keep them in the dark. What should have been simple, obeying the law, not deceiving customers, acting in the best interests of the client, was routinely breached. The Royal Commission made 24 referrals to ASIC and APRA to take action over misconduct. If anything vindicates the ability of Labor to get the big economic calls right, it's our decision to call for the Banking Royal Commission. In the wake of the Royal Commission, the Morrison government claimed it was taking action on all the recommendations. Regarding the Commission's findings on mortgage broker remuneration and trail commissions, Josh Frydenberg simply said, tick. 35 days later, though, in what Chris Bowen's dubbed a backflip with triple pike, a big tick had turned into a big flick. As RMIT Associate Professor Michael Rafferty put it, the decision symbolised the inability within the Liberal Party at the moment to navigate obvious reform. The backflip came despite Commissioner Hayne pointing out that the broker's work is complete when the loan is arranged, and brokers have no obligation to provide continuing services in return for their trail commissions. It came despite a previous Productivity Commission inquiry concluding that, quote, trail commissions have the effect of aligning the broker's interests with those of the lender rather than those of the borrower. The backflip is disappointing, but it's not surprising. As respected economic commentator Michelle Grattan observes, the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government came to office determined to weaken protections in the financial sector. But it does remind Australians what the current government will do when faced with a choice between vested interests and consumer protection. Labor takes a different view. We'll address the Royal Commission's recommendations by legislating a flat upfront commission rate to avoid mortgage brokers' advice being conflicted by the rate of their commission. We'll accept the Royal Commission's recommendation to prohibit trail commissions, abolishing them on new loans from the 1st of July 2020. And we'll ban volume-based commissions and incentives. If we're elected, a Labor government will implement in full the other 75 recommendations of the Royal Commission. Because we called for the Royal Commission, Labor wants to ensure that it's properly implemented. Under a shortened government, we'll require the big four banks, ASIC and APRA, to develop implementation plans by the 1st of August 2019 and publicly report to the Royal Commission Implementation Task Force every 6 months on their progress on implementing recommendations. CEOs of the four major banks and the Australian Banking Association will also be expected to report every 6 months to the House of Representatives Economics Committee. Prompt implementation of the Royal Commission's findings isn't just the right thing to do for consumers, it's also the right thing for the finance sector. If we want our banks to be healthy, respected and ready to deal with upcoming challenges like fintech, we need to address the Royal Commission's findings in a thorough and timely fashion. A stronger finance sector will be good for the Australian economy, but it's not the only reform that's necessary if we're to build a more productive economy. On tax reform, our focus will be on closing tax loopholes. When I was studying public finance, one of my professors was Martin Feldstein, who'd been Ronald Reagan's chair of the Council of Economic Advisers. Feldstein emphasised the importance of reducing what he called tax expenditures, or tax loopholes. Doing so, as he points out, raises revenue more efficiently than raising tax rates. But tax expenditures tend to be much less fair than budgetary expenditures, so closing loopholes is also more equitable than cutting spending. That approach has informed Labor's tax philosophy over recent years, as our economic team has made a number of politically challenging decisions to close tax loopholes. We'll prospectively restrict negative gearing to new-built homes, ensuring that particular tax concession helps add to housing supply. We'll prospectively halve the capital gains tax discount. To address unfair income splitting, trust distributions to adult beneficiaries will attract a minimum tax rate of 30%. For people who don't receive a pension or allowance, we'll end the practice of giving a fistful of cash to people who paid no tax. When I hear the Liberals reflexively defending all of these tax loopholes, I think of Liberal leader Andrew Peacock, who in 1983 described a pension assets test as an assault on the elderly and a callous and cynical grab for funds. If elected, he pledged that the Coalition would repeal the pension assets test. Eventually, the Coalition did win government, but they made no attempt to scrap the pension assets test. By the time the Howard government came to office, the only thing the Liberals had scrapped was their unaffordable and economically reckless pledge to wind back the pension assets test. We also need meaningful action on climate change, action which recognises that climate risks are material and substantial. Natural disasters, which already cost the economy $18 billion a year, are projected to grow more frequent and severe. The Reserve Bank's acknowledged the risk posed to financial stability. APRA has noted the financial risk of unchecked climate change. The Investor Group on Climate Change has pointed to the need for adequate carbon risk disclosure. Yet if the Coalition had a serious plan to address climate change, Malcolm Turnbull would still be the Prime Minister. Emissions are on the rise, and we're not getting the renewables investment that should be flowing to Australia. Labor takes climate change seriously and will act to reduce emissions in line with what the Climate Change Authority says is required to meet our international commitments. And while I'm on the topic, we also believe it is entirely consistent with the best interest duty for superannuation trustees to take account of climate risks in deciding where to invest, as other investors are already doing. Finally, under Labor, you'll see a stronger recognition of the economic value of diversity. The evidence on diversity is strong and growing stronger. Diverse cities are more productive. Diverse firms are more creative. Diverse boards make better decisions. Australia's multiculturalism doesn't just make us a more interesting nation, it's also a core driver of our national prosperity. Reducing gender discrimination is about productivity as well as equity. The Australian Council of Superannuation Investors has played a leading role on issues of diversity. I commend you on taking the panel pledge to only participate in events which are gender diverse. As a political party, Labor has benefited greatly from more women in our caucus. If we win government on the 18th of May, our party room will be, for the first time, 50% women, and will be a better government for it. We also need to recognise the economic benefits of ethnic and racial diversity and the economic cost of allowing hate speech and racial discrimination to flourish. Every Labor MP has signed a parliamentary code of conduct on race and cultural ethics, committing to a fact-based debate on issues of race and ethnicity and valuing diversity. We've repeatedly encouraged our opponents to have their members sign up, but they continue to refuse. As former Race Discrimination Commissioner Tim Soutphommasane has noted, increasingly the Coalition is being defined by its acceptance of right-wing bigotry. It's there in coalition preference deals with Clive Palmer's United Australia Party and Pauline Hanson's One Nation. It's revealed in the flirtation some Liberal MPs have had with the plight of white South African farmers, a cause popular among white supremacists and neo-Nazis. The resignation of 3 Liberal candidates over anti-Muslim and homophobic statements confirms the Trumpification of the party. This is what you get, he writes, when people start believing they have a right to be bigots. Right-wing populism isn't just an issue of politics, it's an issue of economics too. Just imagine if the rest of the world came to perceive that we're engaged in a rerun of the White Australia policy. What would it do to our tourism sector, our education exports, our standing in international economic fora. The social cost would be massive, but so too would be the economic impact. So imagine next time you wanted to catch a flight, that the airline said they didn't know exactly where the plane was going, but they'd love to have you buy a ticket, and the pilots would figure out after takeoff where the plane would go. Is that the kind of plane you'd like to board? Imagine too that the airline couldn't tell you where they were going, but they had a very firm idea of where they were not going. Our competitors like flying to Sydney and Brisbane, they might say. We're definitely not going there. We'll take you to a much better place instead. That doesn't sound like a very attractive airline to you. You should have a similar scepticism about the economic destination to which the coalition proposes to take us. Like Gilbert and Sullivan's Iolanthe, they seem to think that putting "not" in front of Labor's policies constitutes a viable alternative. Australia deserves better than an operetta. Labor's ambitious for Australia, both domestically and on the global stage. In the 2069 days since losing office, who's counting? We've worked as a unified team. We know what we stand for. We know what we want to achieve. You know us, and we know you. And you know how much we value your ideas and your constructive engagement. If we win, we look forward to working with ACSI in government as we strive to be as good a government as the Australian people we seek the honour to represent. Thanks very much.
We've got about 10 minutes if you just want to grab a seat, and
Sure.
I will open this to the floor for questions. Let me just start with one quick. Am I going to muck up anything by changing sides? Typical politician, you've decided exactly where you're going to sit.
I'm blocked by here from seeing half the audience. There we go.
Let me just start with one quick question though, because of course you talk very much about diversity there, and I wondered whether you'd like to make a comment about ACSI's recent policy release on diversity, which is a company should be required to set a time frame for reaching gender balance at board level, and if they don't, or if they make no progress by 2025, there should be regulatory intervention.
I think it's clearly something we need to consider. Ideally, you wouldn't have to regulate in this space. Ideally, boards would recognise the value to their bottom line from greater diversity.
And if they don't, do you think that the law should step in?
Look, it's something we'd have to consider. But I think it would be far better if firms got there on their own. There's just a plethora of fascinating psychological research out there, some of which suggests that having different views in the room can be useful in avoiding groupthink and encouraging people who might imagine that they're the only ones holding that view to speak out. And so, one of the psychological studies suggests that even that diverse views are valuable not only in and of themselves, but also because they elicit greater diversity among the remainder of members.
And a really general question post-Royal Commission, just a general feel. How healthy do you think corporate Australia is?
I think becoming healthier. One of the things I'm struck by in chatting to directors is the extent to which the findings of the Royal Commission have shaped the way in which they view their own duties, even those completely outside the finance sector, and a general awareness that the responsibility of being on a board is a heavy one and requires significant scrutiny over the company's affairs. So I think that flow-on effect was not something I'd been expecting, but I think it's a very good development.
I'm going to open this to the floor.
It's that post-lunch talker.
Well, no, I just can't believe they've got a politician in front of them and they haven't got a question. Guess what we do? Over here. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. I noted your relative, well, I don't think it was throwaway, but your line about the anti-growth Greens or something like that. And then you talked about climate change. How do you think that, against all evidence so far in the world, that economic growth can be disconnected from carbon emissions? There is no evidence anywhere in the world that that is possible.
So thank you very much for the question. I think it's an important one and certainly ties into one of the major policy debates we've been having. My last boss when I was a professor at the Australian National University was Warwick McKibben, who was commissioned by the current government to model the effect on the Australian economy of meeting either a 26% emissions reduction target, which is the current government's approach, or a 45% target, which is what the Climate Change Authority tells us is necessary for Australia to meet its Paris commitments. And Warwick's conclusion was that the economic impact of those two is the same, in part because our current coal-fired power stations are becoming increasingly unreliable. Were indeed the source of recent blackouts when they suddenly went offline. To be relying on generation mechanisms that are being held together by chewing gum and sticky tape is a bad strategy for the stability of our energy grid. So to make a just transition and to find a smooth pathway from coal-fired generation towards wind and solar, backed up with increasing battery systems and greater interconnectors, that to me is sensible economic reform, and it's where the market is pointing. There's no market appetite for building new coal-fired power stations, for example.
I'll just repeat the question. The follow-up was we have to go to 100%, not 45%, and there's no evidence that that can be done without affecting economic growth, and we're talking about renewables, obviously. Yeah,
the example that's most salient for me is the link between urban air pollution and economic growth. So and they talk about this as the environmental Kuznets curve. There was an early period of our history in which, as we grew, our cities got dirtier and dirtier, and there was more and more pollution in them. And then at a certain point, we decoupled urban air pollution from economic growth. We began to clean up our cities. You didn't have the great smogs of London that you read about in Charles Dickens' novels, and yet the economy continued to grow. So I'm entirely comfortable that the same is possible to do in the issue of climate change. I see great potential for renewables industries, not just in Australia, but also exporting. You look at our lithium deposits and our ability to tap into the world's demand for batteries, for example. The work being done by our researchers around silicon and solar cells. There's great potential for Australia to use our know-how to boost growth in a clean, green fashion.
Question here. And then next to the lady in red next. Oh, okay, thank you. Ladies first.
Thank you, Claire Molinari from AXI. When Turnbull was in government, he talked a lot about innovation. After he left, there was no talk about innovation. I also haven't heard a whole lot from Labor about innovation, but as we move to sort of a post-carbon world in the future, and across various areas, there's a huge need for innovation. So I'm just wondering what Labor will do about innovation.
Great question, Claire. So I touched on a little in talking about the decline of Australia's startups, which is an undernoted fact of our economy, but one that worries me deeply. We need an ecosystem that doesn't just allow large monopolists to do well, but also creates the ability of scrappy startups to challenge them. We've said that we would engage in a series of competition reforms, including providing more resources to the regulator, giving them a market studies power, enabling greater competition in a range of digital sectors. Ed Husick's made announcements around an Centre for Artificial Intelligence Excellence. Kim Carr yesterday announced a new smart manufacturing facility in South Australia. So we need to do more to create the opportunity for new firms to emerge, because we do, as the Atlas of Economic Complexity noted, have too many eggs in the one basket problem in Australia, not just because we're fortunate enough to have significant minerals deposits, but even our services sector is overly concentrated in a few industries. Greater diversity allows you to better weather global shocks, but it also gives young people more opportunities. So as we boost human capital, we also need to have the industries of the future for people to go into.
We'll finish this question over here.
Thomas Clark, UTS. Andrew, speculatively, you're about to embark on a two-term Labour government. That 6-year period is a reasonable investment period. What personally would you like to see achieved in that period? How will Australia look in 6 years after this Labour government?
Thomas, I'd hope if we were fortunate enough to be elected that we would leave an Australia which was more prosperous and fairer, which played a more significant role in global forums, in the spirit very much of how the Hawke-Keating governments managed to engage us with APEC and the Rudd and Gillard governments through the G20. I would hope that we would manage to take a significant step forward in the area of Indigenous reconciliation through an Indigenous voice to Parliament, and that we would be able to create an economy which worked for the vast bulk of people. While ever wage rises are happening in the corner offices but not on the factory floor, people are going to feel a deep sense of unfairness about the economic system. We need just a bit of stability. The ambulance services, when they came across somebody with a head injury and they wanted to assess their state of consciousness, used to ask them to name the Prime Minister. They don't do that anymore because it's not a good indicator of whether you've had a head injury. That's bad for business. Business needs that sense of stability, and I would hope that in some sense you're able to say, well, government can be trusted to get on with the basic things that government is tasked with. I'll focus on getting on with being an effective investor, a good manager, and on my own areas. So we would aim, above all else, I think, to bring that sense of stability and purpose as commingled with the ambition that I spoke about in the remarks before.
2 terms. I mean, the polls will say certainly we'll get the first one, but anything can happen in politics, and indeed 10 days is a long time. How are you rating your chances?
Look, I'm an electoral pessimist, so having seen Kim Beazley fall agonisingly short in 2001, I'll be out there arguing for every vote for every Labor candidate until polling day. It is a huge thing to change the government. It's only 3 times before that Labor has moved from opposition into government. So there's no chicken counting or curtain measuring. It is all purposive and focused right now.
Please join me in thanking Andrew Leigh for his time this afternoon.
Thank you.
I'd now like to welcome Senator Jane Hume to the stage. Jane's a Liberal Party senator from Victoria. She's chair of the Economics Legislation Committee. She was elected in 2016 and has a Bachelor of Commerce at the University of Melbourne with further qualifications in political science. She's held various senior positions in the financial services industry, working for National Australia Bank, Rothschilds Australia, Deutsche Bank, and immediately prior to her election as a senior policy advisor at Australian Super. Please welcome Jane Hume.
Well, thank you everybody for having me along here today. Can I make a few acknowledgements before we begin? First of all, to my parliamentary colleague Andrew Leigh, before he walks out of the room. Thank you very much, Andrew. There were some surprising remarks there. I didn't realise we were in here doing campaign speeches. I would have prepared something entirely different. We would have been fighting them on the beaches, Andrew. Fighting them on the beaches. I also want to acknowledge a very special person to me, and that's Ian Silk, who is, of course, the president of AXI, but he also used to be my boss at Australian Super, and there are very few people that know more about the Australian superannuation industry than Ian Silk, so I want to thank you for your friendship and, of course, your stewardship of this extraordinary organisation. Ali Moore, isn't she a terrific MC and moderator? She also is, I've discovered quite recently, an alumni of my college at university, so it's terrific to be here with you today, Ali. And also to all of the members of the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, thank you very much for inviting me here today. In fact, you didn't really invite me. You invited Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer of the country, and I am here standing in for Josh, who is fighting them on the beaches. Well, maybe not on the beaches, but certainly on the leafy streets of Kooyong today. So I'm definitely stepping in for him. Look, from my perspective, it is terrific to be here, to take a break from the campaign trail, to be back in a room full of my former colleagues. And I'm assuming that I have slightly less chance of being egged in here. We'll see about that. Depends, I suppose, on what it is. Anybody who's actually got a dozen eggs, it just, can we have them confiscated before you walk into the room? So much of the conversation that you've clearly had today has focused around investment criteria, and that includes standards of governance that we should be expecting in the corporate sector. And of course, this is a fascinating subject in the wake of the Banking Royal Commission. And forgive me, this is not a campaign speech. I did not walk in here expecting to try and lobby you or lobby your votes. From my perspective, if you ask me to speak on a particular subject, that's exactly what I intend to speak on. Labor quite clearly chooses to answer your question, not necessarily by dealing directly with the question that you posed, but by telling you that the question that you posed was wrong and answering the question that it chooses to answer. So that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about financial services. So financial services obviously still accounts for a third of the ASX market cap. And of course, the expectation is that this group in this room will make upon the governance of many companies in the ASX in their investment pool. It's also, interestingly, an expectation that it will make on a number of its competitors. So this is a really interesting dichotomy, I think. The standards of governance that will characterise our banking, our superannuation and financial sectors, and what that sort of best practice governance looks like is a very timely discussion point. So since the release of the Banking Royal Commission's recommendations, the government has focused on a timely but also a genuinely considered and fulsome response. And it's important to recognise, I think, that those responses in particular build on the work that was already done, and considerable amount of work has been done in the financial services space in the last 6 years, starting with, of course, the Murray Financial Services Inquiry. And those in this room know that a lot of that reform was already underway across the financial services well before the Banking Royal Commission. So while all of us, from customers and directors to politicians, will judge and prioritise different concerns that the Banking Royal Commission made, we all seek a standard of best practice and higher standards of governance. And we all seek a banking and financial services system that has a strong ethical and transparent and consistent standard of corporate culture, buttressed with a specific focus on diversity and also on inclusion. And can I just, while I'm here, please allow me to tip my hat to those in the banking and financial services space, and including many superannuation funds that are represented here today, that have already taken so much work in this particular area, and they're really leading the way. I think that this deserves to be commended. So before launching into the government's perspective on the Banking Royal Commission, I'd just like to touch on some of the other work that has already been done. You've already heard today, I know, from APRA and from ASIC, and while I didn't see them on the agenda, I doubt that there's a person in the room that's unfamiliar with some of the work in the Productivity Commission has done in the superannuation space, and prior work also in that sector. So let's just start with the first review that APRA undertook into CBA. So many of the issues that were raised in the Banking Royal Commission were not new. APRA's review of the Commonwealth Bank last year red flagged a number of issues, and in particular it highlighted inadequate oversight and the challenges of boards and their gatekeeper committees of overseeing emerging non-financial risks. Also, unclear accountabilities, which started with the lack of ownership of key risks at executive committee level, and weaknesses in particular of how issues, incidents and risks were identified and escalated through their institutions, and a lack of urgency in subsequent resolutions and management of those issues. And also in remuneration frameworks. Obviously you've just discussed that before Andrew and I came on today. And particularly that, until the AUSTRAC action that APRA took, that had little, the AUSTRAC action from CBA, there was little sting, I suppose, for senior managers above when poor risk or customer outcomes materialised. So the panel at APRA made a series of specific recommendations designed to strengthen the governance and the accountability and the culture within the CBA. And those recommendations were many, and they were varied, and they were aimed at injecting that culture of change that moves the dial from reactive and complacent to an empowered and challenging and striving for best practice in risk identification and also in remediation. Now, one of those recommendations was exacting accountability standards that were reinforced by those remuneration practices, a banking and executive accountability regime. I'm sure you're all familiar with the BEAR. So, on to the next stage. APRA followed its CBA review with a thematic review of board governance, which recommended a number of things: that registered superannuation entity licensees boards consider the extent to which the use of independent experts on those boards signalled a skills deficiency on the board, and whether that skills deficiency would be more appropriately addressed by appointing independent directors with the requisite skills rather than appointing independent experts. And also it recommended that RSE licensees have a more robust and objective board assessment process that considers the performance of the board as a whole, and as well the performance of individual directors, and identified recommendations to improve the performances improved performance that are effectively implemented. And then there was a Productivity Commission review, and we saw the results of that released earlier this year. And that made a number of recommendations also regarding the efficiency of the superannuation system, including, as you well know, underperforming funds and multiple funds, but also recommendations to amend prudential standards for trustee directors of superannuation funds, and included in that were requiring trustees of all superannuation funds to have and use and disclose a process to effectively assess their board's performance relative to its objectives, and also the performance of individual directors. Included things like requiring trustee boards to maintain a skills matrix and annually publish a consolidated summary of that matrix, along with the collective skills of the trustee directors. There were a number of other issues that are also mentioned. There's a less canvas area that the Productivity Commission picked up on, was evaluating financial literacy and acknowledging of customers, and acknowledging the needs to address gaps in the financial capability of customers, as well as the gaps in the corporate governance framework of some of our major banking and financial institutions, and those things sort of mirror some of the Banking Royal Commission's findings, which is why it's so important to talk about the Banking Royal Commission in the context of all those previous inquiries. So finally, the Banking Royal Commission. We had the Banking Royal Commission release its report in February and all 76 of its recommendations. And I think those of you that are here today who are so very familiar with the processes of evaluation of company performance would agree that many of the lessons of the Banking Royal Commission may well apply to industries beyond financial services, especially where governance and directors' duties are concerned. Now, the very nature of issues that brought out in the course of the Banking Royal Commission demonstrate somewhat the limits of legislative remedies to many of those issues, and how the ultimate responsibility for cultural change lies with the companies themselves. And the impetus for change, of course, comes from the owners of those companies, the shareholders, and the board who represent them, which is why the work that you do is so very important. So the Commission noted that the tone of an entity is and must be set at the top. And while all levels of a company, from management to other employees, contribute to culture, what the board says, what the board does, and what it expects is absolutely vital in setting the tone for an organisation. And although culture can't be legislated, no matter who tells you it can be, it can't be, the Commissioner also suggested that it should be assessed and it should be reassessed constantly to align with the values of those companies. Interestingly, the Banking Royal Commission also recommended, with explicit reference to APRA, that regulators should assess what kinds of cultural norms result in misconduct. Another recommendation, of course, was that directors should act in the best interest of the company. Now this, I'm sure anybody with any experience in this room would know that that's to state the obvious, but what it means is taking a long-term view to ensure that there isn't any inconsistency between the interests of stakeholders, the interests of shareholders, customers, employees, and other stakeholders. So we've seen this approach taken in the United Kingdom. I think it's been quite interesting there. Directors there have a duty to promote the success of the company. There, directors' duties have been codified to require consideration of the interest of companies' employees, the need to foster the company's business relationships with suppliers, with customers and with others, and also the impact of the company's operations on the community and on the environment, which to some extent encapsulates the ESG discussions that you were having earlier. Reforms have also been proposed in UK law that would require directors to make a statement in publicly available annual reports of the company explaining exactly how they have gone about considering those matters and exercising those duties. That's quite an onerous requirement and something to consider. Another issue is the need for companies to consider both the financial and non-financial matters. And the Commission pointed out, the Banking Royal Commission pointed out that due consideration by directors to both financial matters like liquidity, capital and credit risk, and also non-financial matters such as regulatory matters, conduct, compliance, reputational risks when discharging their duties. Now, financial risks in the 21st century, as you well all know, are not the only risks that matter to companies in this industry and other industries as well. There were questions raised about the adequacy of resources also to manage those non-financial risks. There's also a body of case law that supports the consideration, this consideration. There was a case, ASIC versus Casamatius, where Justice Edelman held that directors' duties included protecting a company's reputation. Another recommendation was improving the effectiveness of board meetings. During the Commission, the relationship between boards and their executive and management teams were considered quite extensively. So various shortcomings of board practices were highlighted through those hearings, and here there are some other important issues to remember. The government has actually already acted on some of that recommendation by compelling superannuation funds, as you would know, to hold AGMs each year. That's just one response that, and I'll talk about a few more of those shortly. There is also the need to contest management. The Commission highlighted the need for boards to sufficiently challenge recommendations of management and management's advice, rather than just simply accepting recommendations on their face value. And in the final report, the Commission commented that the task of the board is overall superintendence of the company. I thought that was an excellent word, superintendence. But an integral part of that task is being able and willing to challenge management on key issues and doing that whenever is necessary. A further recommendation was the need for adequate information to support board decisions. The Commission noted that the level of detail that management provides to the board in board packs, and many of you would receive them, sometimes you get a board pack that's better used as a doorstop, that these have been impaired in decision making and consideration of the non-financial risks by gaps in reporting to the board and its committees. Now, board materials should be complete, they should be balanced, and they should contain sufficient detail to ensure that directors can distill the right level of information and produce quality decision making. The final report also said that often improving the quality of information given to boards will require directors receiving less material but more information. Boards need to be given the right information in order to perform their duties. And finally, there was a recommendation also on board meetings, that directors should take the necessary time in board meetings to understand and to test issues. So the Commission highlighted the need for sufficient time to be allocated to agenda items in each meeting so that directors have the opportunity to understand all issues and ensure that they take the time to make those vitally important decisions. I would caveat that, however, with the fact that what constitutes adequate time for meetings in terms of standard best practices is highly subjective and context dependent and really up to the organisation itself. Minute taking also should be transparent and objective. So there's no surprise in this room, I would imagine, that considerable work has clearly been done in this space already, and there is more work to do. So let me talk to you now very briefly in the time I have left about the government's, specifically the government's response. In February, we announced action on all 76 recommendations contained in the Royal Commission. Restoring trust in Australia's financial system is a vital part, a fundamental part of the Coalition's plan for a stronger economy, and why that's meaningful, and that's why a meaningful and considered response to what were some fairly robust recommendations, rather than just a campaign slogan, is what's needed. So since receiving that final report, the Coalition Government have already expanded AFCA's remit to consider financial complaints back 10 years, right back to 2008. We've passed legislation through the Senate that prohibits superannuation funds from treating employers in anticipation, treating employers is the term, in anticipation that they'll recommend the fund to their employees. That was a specific recommendation. We've also passed legislation through the Senate that extends civil penalties to superannuation funds and trustees. We've announced a capability review of APRA, which I'm sure was spoken about this morning. We've been working with the states and territories on a national farm debt remediation scheme. We've also announced a review of financial counselling, which is becoming increasingly in demand in Australia. That is a going further step rather than just response to a recommendation, and indeed it also responds to some of the Productivity Commission's concerns that I mentioned earlier. And of course the BEAR, the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, having already been initiated and implemented before the Banking Royal Commission even began, that can now extend to other parts of the sector in a less disruptive manner as per the Hayne Royal Commission recommendation. So the Coalition has responded to the Banking Royal Commission's, initially responded within 4 days of receiving the report, and also committed to a review of the effectiveness for customers and also the timeliness of implementation across regulators and industry within 3 years. The Banking Royal Commission does demand action, certainly. We can all agree on that. But as we learned through the Financial Systems Inquiry, the Murray Review, the changes to this industry, to our industry, have extraordinary far-reaching consequences for the consumer and also for the industry and also for the broader economy. And many reforms that have been undertaken, and many reforms have already been undertaken, you know that, you're at the front line, you've seen them already implemented and taking place. But you would know too that appropriate consultation with industry and consideration of unintended consequences is vital if we're to ensure a robust and competitive industry. Knee-jerk reactions are entirely inappropriate and in fact quite dangerous. Sometimes these responses take time, much to the frustration of many. But as a government, we're committed to optimal outcomes in financial services for all Australians. So finally, a personal word, and this is not a campaign pitch and not a campaign slogan. I genuinely loved working in financial services, and particularly in superannuation, and I greatly admire the work that is done in this industry. Yours is an industry in which there is so much to be admired, and it's so important not just to the millions of Australians whose retirement savings are invested with you, but to the function of the economy more broadly. Now, each and every one of you are responsible for not millions, not billions, but collectively you are responsible for trillions of dollars that belong to ordinary people who trust you implicitly, and that's why they call you trustees. And while Bible quotes aren't usually my thing, allow me to misquote Luke 12:48. To those who have been given much, much is expected. Much of the conversation that you've had today with your colleagues has been about the exceptions of the companies in which you invest, the expectations of the companies in which you invest. Culture and skill sets and gender parity, holding up the mirror, particularly on those issues of corporate culture and corporate governance, is just as important as demanding it of others. Certainly the same goes for politics. And if your firm, in your mind, it may well be the gold standard, that's terrific. I hope it is. But you're an industry of so many associations just like this one. And as we're reminded repeatedly, the standard you walk by is the standard you accept. So change from the better yes, you should certainly expect that of the companies in which you invest, but it always is best when it comes from within. So help your industry become the best it can be by showing no tolerance for unacceptable or inadequate governance or culture within your own ranks. So on that note, which didn't sound very cheery, but it should have been encouraging, because the work you do is so good and so important. On behalf of the Treasurer and on behalf of myself, can I say thank you very much for your time here today.
Thank you, Jane. I will take questions from the floor in just a minute. I just wanted to throw a few quick questions to you. I just wonder, when you're talking there about change, how do you see the role of the people in this room in bringing that change about, in persuading the companies they invest in that there may be a better way of doing things?
Well, there's an enormous weight of money in the superannuation industry, isn't there? Was it $2.8 trillion, I think we're dealing with now? The size of your industry is, well, the size of the funds in superannuation is larger than GDP. There is an enormous weight of money here, and influence as well. There's an understanding that the superannuation industry is going to own a significant proportion, already does own a significant proportion of ASX-listed companies, but it will own a far greater proportion in the years to come. So therefore, you have significant power to encourage those companies to pursue their commercial goals in a certain way. Now, that is a power that must be used responsibly, not for nefarious purposes or any, indeed, alternative purposes other than for the benefit of members.
And when you talked earlier too about the role of other stakeholders, you mentioned the system in the UK where there's a requirement to consider other stakeholders under the legal definition of the role or duty of a director. How do you see the legislated role of the director in Australia? Is it sufficient? Does it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it is quite broad at the moment. I mean, at the moment, an organisation, a director of an organisation must act in the best interest of the company. But what does the company look like these days? Who is the company? Is it the shareholder? Is that only pure profit motive? Is it broader stakeholders? Does it include the customer? Does it include employees? Who is the company? And I think that that's an interesting definition. It used to be a euphemism for profit, but what is it now? And I think that we're seeing the rise of social enterprises in particular in this space. That demonstrates that there often can be a charter that is above and beyond the profit motive. But it's something that needs to be managed very, very carefully, because we don't want to diminish the importance of the returns that superannuation funds make too.
Does that imply that the Coalition would actually be interested in rethinking the definition of a director's duty, or is that more a broader conversation around the existing?
I think at the moment it's very broad indeed, but the problem is with that is it does have some grey areas. For instance, a director of a company at the moment that has a social enterprise charter. Once that company is diluted, the capital of that company is diluted, potentially that charter can be diminished because of a profit motive of shareholders that come in with that new capital. So I do think it's worth considering. I know that there are organisations that people like B Corp, for instance, have been looking at changing the corporations legislation in order to clarify that definition of directors' duties. I think that's worth considering. It's something that I've had a look at.
That's something that, if you get back into government, we shall have to pursue with you. A question
when, Ali, when?
A question I put to Andrew too, the gender diversity targets as per the policy proposal of ACSI, which is that gender balance at board level, companies should be giving a time frame, and if they don't, or they don't make significant progress by 2025, there should be a regulatory intervention. Would you be in favour of that?
No, I wouldn't be. I genuinely don't think you should legislate gender targets. And I don't want to get into the argument about quotas versus targets or any of those sorts of things. This probably is not the right forum for that. But I do think that, as I said earlier, the best change comes from within. Organic change is sustainable change.
But what if organic change doesn't happen?
But it is happening, Ali. I mean, and you can see that. From a government's perspective, we've already, we have a target of 50% women on government boards. Which we're pursuing actively, and in fact the vast majority of positions that we have appointed in the last 6 years have gone to women. And it is an organic change. And I think that corporations are well within their rights to not necessarily have government unnecessarily meddle with their governance arrangements if they can do it themselves.
Open this to the floor for questions. One here.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. The first is around the backflip around trailing commissions.
Sorry, around what?
The backflip on trailing commissions.
Trailing commissions and...
Helpfully outlined by Andrew Leigh.
Following the logic of your presentation, we really don't understand why that happened, unless it was lobbying or what the rest of that, whatever happened. But surely you're not suggesting then that backflipping on that is because removing trailing commissions will have a significant impact on our economy.
Right. So we're talking about mortgage brokers here, I'm assuming, just for the clarification of the room. So one of the recommendations of the Royal Commission was quite a significant overhaul of the mortgage broking industry. And the problem is with that is, of course, it genuinely removes one of the pillars of competition within the retail mortgage market. And that so many Australians, I think around 50% of home loans now are written through mortgage brokers, and a lot of those mortgages, through those mortgage brokers, go to the smaller banks as well, rather than the big four. So it was sort of, it had quite a destructive effect on competition in the industry. Now the mortgage broking industry is already doing, it realised it had some problems well before the Banking Royal Commission took place. So it is already doing a review of its own code of conduct. And we have said that we will give that a number of years, I think we said 2 years, before we would then do a reassessment to see if the culture has resulted in changed practices. And that would be less disruptive to the competition in the home loan market.
But you initially said that you would, to follow up the question, you did say that you would ban them from 2020. That was the initial response. Then it was changed to a review, I think, after 3 years.
Yes, you're right, it was 3 years.
What did that result from? Was it lobbying from the industry?
Well, certainly the industry was quite vocal on the issue, but our focus has been, and always is, whether it be in superannuation, whether it be in bank customers, the end user, not the industry itself. Now, our concern was that it would not be a beneficial outcome for consumers if that part of the industry was disrupted to such an extent that people only went to the big four banks for their home loans rather than looking elsewhere. They tend to look elsewhere via a mortgage broking industry. If we dismantled the industry entirely, it would have negative consequences rather than positive.
Another question?
The second part of my question was around, you spoke about productivity inquiry, recommendation around independent directors, but surely the Royal Commission has shown us the worst players with the most abhorrent practices are ones with boards that are proliferated with independent directors and don't have the voice of their customer or their member in that boardroom.
So
what's the question?
So the question is, do you still hold, and does the party still hold an objective to push for more independent directors on boards?
Right. The boards of superannuation.
Yep. So the Productivity Commission review actually was quite interesting on that. It actually said, look, forget this issue of independent directors. Concentrate more on the skill sets of directors and their abilities in their decision making and how that skills matrix works out. And I actually think that that's a very happy compromise. What the difference between superannuation boards and ASX boards, for instance, tends to be things like on that issue of skill sets, but also on tenure. And I think that if we could make the superannuation industry boards more reflective of the governance demands that they place on the companies in which they invest, that would be a good step in the right direction.
That legislation, though, which you could never get through the Senate, have you given up completely, or is it sitting there on the back burner waiting for another day?
Well, I think that that legislation will lapse with the lapse of the Parliament, but and it's not necessarily something that I think that we have said that we will actively pursue. That said, I think everybody in the room wants best practice. The problem is best practice is a little bit like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And we all have a sort of slightly different view on what best practice is. So, best practice might not necessarily just be the best returns. It's the best outcome for members, isn't it? So I think, we'll go from there.
Do we have time for one last quick question? No, you've all been silenced. Well, look, let me finish with just the same question that I asked Andrew Leigh, really, which I think you probably answered by correcting me. Chances on May the 18th of another term? I'm quite the opposite of Andrew Leigh. I'm the eternal optimist and a glass half full kind of gal. And I think that potentially the momentum is with us. If you had have asked me a couple of months ago, 6 months ago, I think I probably would have been a little bit more negative. But Victoria is probably not the best place to judge the result of the national poll. I speak to my Senate colleagues in the other states, and they're feeling quite buoyant. So yes, watch this space. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Please join me in thanking Senator Jane Hume.